I am Khush Chopra, and Khush Chopra Live is a robust discussion of important issues that matter to Singaporeans. This is a special GE 2020 edition of Khush Chopra Live. My opinions are my own. They do not represent those of any organization that I may be a member of or am otherwise associated with. Please send in your comments and your questions, and we will try to get to that. My guests today are Tay Kheng and Swee Yong. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Khush, for having us.
Great pleasure. Swee Yong is a property expert and author of several books, and one that is coming out soon, Preparing for a Property Upturn. Rather optimistic tone, and I look forward to that book.
Yeah, we've got to prepare. But
Yes.
when it comes, that's another question.
Cheers. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Kheng Soon needs no introduction. In fact, both of the gentlemen here don't need no introduction. Kheng Soon is an extremely well-known architect and social commentator. My guests are non-partisan and not affiliated to any political party. The topic for the day is a very interesting and topical one, if I may say so myself. It is the 10 million population mark. Wah piang eh. Why is I calling Hokkien? But I think we shall stick to
English.
English. This GE continues to be mired in some controversy. Today we refer to the clash between Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan and Dr. Chee Soon Juan regarding the idea of a 10 million Singapore population during the GE debate telecast. We look at the population problem, the government social distancing itself from a 10 million population target, and the implications of population growth on housing and jobs. I will ask my guests about the reasons why we need population growth, the 1.5 million actual growth in population between 2004 to 2019, living in population density, our infrastructure deficiencies, the 2013 population white paper and growth targets, the population growth impact on jobs, and the impact on housing. Let's start, shall we?
Yes, please.
First, the reasons why we need population growth. Swee Yong?
No, population is a very important factor. The issue is really what kind of population. The kind of straight line projection that resulted in the 10 million is based on a very simplistic idea that the economic growth or economic health is parallel by the population size, which is absolute nonsense. Let me give you a few examples. When in the heyday of Venice, let's go back to ancient history. In the heyday of Venice is this tiny little artificial floating island in the middle of a lagoon in northern Italy, right? With a population the same size as Toa Payoh. And yet, it controlled the economic trade and military power of the whole of the Mediterranean.
Indeed.
350,000 people, that's all. Now, contrast that to the present situation in Silicon Valley. 3.5 million to 4 million people, right? Can really change the history of the world through new technology. Why? Because a lot of smart people. So therefore, the issue of 10 million is a total misconception, right? It's a straight line projection that is really quite, to me, very silly.
Okay, I want to put it in a bit more context. The old planning methodology starts with a GDP growth target and a long-term GDP growth target of 2% per year or 1% per year naturally requires a certain labor force. And this labor force growth then requires a certain population growth to produce that number of workers, but the quality and the intellectual property of that labor force that is growing, that hasn't been well accounted for. And therefore, using a long-term population growth figure, you then subsequently equal to a certain population growth number. And with that target, let's then start working backwards and implementing our concept planning, which is a 30 to 50 year infrastructure plan. And then that distills downwards into a master plan, which we revise every 5 years, and it shows us over the next 15 years what the policy planners are going to build. And therefore, we have got Greater Southern Waterfront, we've got a redevelopment of Palembang Air Base, we've got a Tengah Forest Town. All these things require long-term thinking, and it requires us to have some form of a final target number. But whether the number should be 10 million or not, that's another story.
Are we not concerned about fertility rates and the government justification for population growth?
In the population growth numbers, I think you would assume a certain positive case scenario or a certain realistic scenario about fertility and about the citizens.
No, let's be very, very specific.
Okay.
The total fertility rate in Singapore is 1.14
Yes.
per childbearing woman,
Yes.
which means that Singaporeans are not even in the situation of reproducing their own self,
Correct.
right? Which means that if you are talking about an enlarged population, it means that the majority of the enlarged population must be foreigners.
That's implied, correct?
No, it's not implied. It's a mathematical inevitability.
Yes. But there was an optimistic case where the TFR actually goes up. So,
In all developed countries, the TFR has been dropping.
Yes.
So therefore, urbanization actually is the most effective form of family control. So therefore, we are no different from the rest of Tokyo or New York or any of the big countries, right?
Well, I'm glad I brought up TFR.
Yeah. No, I told you I would interrupt.
Please be my guest. Be my guest.
it is part of the equation
Yes,
to
exactly.
extrapolate population
I think
growth.
we
Yes.
we must acknowledge that there is some reason to want population growth. What that population growth should look like, and we will come to and we will discuss. The 1.54 million actual growth in our population between 2004 to 2019 last year. In fact, as of 31st December last year, the official Singapore population size stood at, 5.7 million,
That number is based on the 30th of June 2019.
Yes.
So every year this population number gets revised and published around September, which is coming in 2 months. And the cutoff date is the middle of the year.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood. So December is not correct
Yeah, so it's June.
month.
Yeah.
Understood. Thank you. Singapore's population had exploded from 4.2 million people in 2005 to 5 million people in 2010, a whopping 800,000 population increase in just 5 years due to perhaps importing foreigners. We will discuss that. In fact, the population explosion started from 2004. We had a total population of 4.14 million. From 2004 to 2019, our population grew by 1.54 million. What was this rate of growth? 35%?
Over 15 years,
Yes.
35%. Actually, percentage annually sounds okay if the supporting infrastructure, healthcare, education, your basic utilities such as your longkangs, sewage, transportation,
Discuss that.
if all those things can support, fine.
I understand.
Yep.
But a 2.3% rate itself, is that of any concern to anyone?
Of course, it's a great concern to the Singapore population, because what it means is that Singaporeans are going to be in a difficult competitive situation in relation to foreign labor. And because of the cheap foreign labor that's coming in, right, the wages at the lower end of the social structure is being artificially or naturally depressed.
Yes.
And this is what's happening, and this is the reason why Singaporeans are very fed up.
Remember the curry cooking incidents?
That too.
Yeah.
And social
So
issues.
while we can build the longkangs and the supporting infrastructure quickly,
Right.
we are not able to socially integrate with that 1.5 million extra people who came in within the last 15
Yeah,
years.
and this point was already highlighted by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself, who actually warned of the danger of the kind of conflict between locals and foreigners.
Yes.
Right?
In fact, that brings me to my very next question, Keng Soon, and
Good,
I'm glad
good.
you brought it up.
Yeah.
Was the population growth the reason for anti-foreigner sentiments that were?
Of course, because
that we saw
it's
across
an issue of
2011?
jobs.
It might have been because we are not so used to seeing so many people of different cultures around us, not just work culture in the office. You see many people in the hawker centers, in the supermarkets who may have slightly different behaviors, and all these changes came within a very short time.
Yeah.
So we are not used to it.
I'm going to draw your attention to a question that's rather relevant to what we've just discussed by Mr. Michael Au, and he's got this question for you, Keng Soon.
Yeah, I don't understand the question.
Who
Is it
caused the
possible
TFR issue?
to have reduced population with technology and efficiency? Why must we have a replacement rate to even maintain the population? In fact, he's made your Venice point. Is it an issue to return to 3.4 million population? So I guess what he's saying is it quantity or quality? To some extent. And do we need to be preoccupied with replacement rate? We seem to be. I think it's a good
I think
question.
the question was, what is the cause of the TFR?
The low TFR.
The decline of
Oh,
TFR.
well, that's a very big topic. I mean,
No, it's not a big topic
Please.
because it is generally observable in all developed countries that TFR drops.
Right.
So Singapore is no different from Tokyo or Germany or New
Switzerland,
York
Korea.
or Switzerland. It's the same, right? People who are doing better in life, right? They just want to have less children because children are a burden.
But having said that, and if they want to have, should we be preoccupied with population replacement or growth? That's the question.
There's no need to, if we are growing population, or if we are having a population of high quality, and that goes back to the Silicon Valley example, they control how much of the technological growth, the value, intellectual property, and they can maintain Silicon Valley with a low density and still be growing the economy. So we could go after that type of growth model, but let me bring us back again to a little bit more history. In 2000, we had suffered due to the 9/11 incident in New York. Subsequently, we had SARS in 2003. So it was a difficult few years in our economy. Remember, there was one of the first committees formed to revamp our economy. At that time, we also had a minister called Mr. Raymond Lim. Yeah. And so when we were considering economic growth at that time, we realized that due to SARS, many foreigners left Singapore for a short period of half a year to a year, and that our domestic population was actually too small to be economically viable. We didn't have the consumption, and therefore, at that time, several indicators were sort of used. How does Hong Kong not suffer as badly, especially in the consumer side?
In fact, Lee Kuan Yew spoke about Hong Kong's vibrancy. I remember this
Exactly.
very well.
So then these numbers of 6 million, 10 million type of target, we did look at what other countries were doing. So what is a sustainable local population that we might want to aim towards? That's what I recall from reading the news articles.
In answer to that question, it's beyond just fertility rate. There are other reasons,
Yes.
including the economic case.
Yes.
Now let's press on with the 1.4 million population explosion, shall we? Between 2004 to 2019. What part of that growth was organic? Do we have the statistics?
The breakdown
Singaporeans,
of population growth isn't that clear, because every year we welcome new permanent residents. Every year we manage to convert some permanent residents into citizens. Every year some permanent residents might have also given up their PR-ship, and then we need to add births and we need to minus out deaths.
And there's just no clarity and transparency on this subject.
I have tried analyzing and breaking these numbers down before, but it
Have
is
you
not.
asked SingStat for literally asked them for
I
a breakdown?
have
Has anybody asked them
exchanged
for
a few email before. Not all these numbers are available.
So we don't know who came, essentially. Which age group, from which country, why the secrecy?
I don't think there's any secrecy.
Well, we don't know.
No,
There's a mystery, at least, no
we know
secrecy.
roughly that there's a big chunk of domestic workers, right?
Yes.
There's a big chunk of construction workers,
Yes.
right? There is a smaller chunk of value-adding foreigners, right?
Employment pass holders.
Yeah, these are relatively minority, right? So the issue is why is the construction industry so inefficient that we have been talking about, mechanization and so on and so forth, and we have not really achieved that. Why is that so? And why is it that our domestic helpers are so necessary, right? And so these are very interrelated issues, right? Which could have been addressed, right? But I think were neglected.
Those are the pass holders. On the pass holder side, why didn't productivity go up such that we continue to need more and more of them? That's one thing to discuss. But on the non-pass holder side, the permanent residents and the citizen side, for example, this year, if we were to welcome 25,000 permanent residents to be citizens, what's the makeup of these 25,000 people? How many are parents? How many are kids? What sort of nationality were they previously of?
Which countries did they come from?
And what's the demographic spread of these 25,000 people who became new citizens?
Should we not know that? Shouldn't we be told that? I mean,
In fact,
you brought in so many people.
I think
Give us the numbers.
Yeah, I think the issue is really labor productivity, right? The economy that we have, right, is still rather labor intensive. Although we've been trying to automate, we've been trying to increase our efficiency and so on and so forth,
Yes.
we have still been kind of addicted to high labor inputs,
Yes.
which I think is for a developed country at our level of GDP, right? Something's gonna miss.
Yes, it has. And I believe that also starts from education. The
Yeah.
local universities have made huge strides in getting international rankings. Our children have gotten very high PISA scores, but how many patents do we issue a year? How many of our corporations are living on royalties generated by these patents? And how many Nobel Prize nominees have we seen in this country?
Real serious issues.
That's right.
So meaning the money that we spend is not being used efficiently, so the efficacy, or the returns on that spend.
Yeah, the argument is goes back to Lee Kuan Yew's genetic theory, right?
Yeah.
That for some strange reason of his, that genetically we are somehow inferior. And that is why we need to have foreign talent, right?
Yes.
But I tell you, I teach at the university, I can tell you, the amount of talent that comes into the university is enormous. Yes. But at the same time, the amount of fear and lack of confidence is also enormous. So this is the problem. We have a raw talent, right? But the opportunity cost to exercise that talent is prohibitive. And that is why people hold back. And this is why we need foreign talent. This is the problem. So it is a political, cultural problem.
But would the foreign talent then come in and then be creative and start to speak their minds?
Of course not, because I also have many of my colleagues are from overseas, they are teaching, right?
Yep.
They tell me quite plainly that they will not speak up their views because they don't want to anger or displease the powers that be. So therefore there's a holding back. So foreigners are holding back, locals are holding back. So we have a talent problem.
In fact, the evidence is therefore to the contrary.
Yeah, right.
So, this question of data and evidence to study the actual population explosion, as I call it, is necessary.
You mean the foreign population explosion?
In our population explosion.
We have no.
Well,
Total
the
population.
problem
Oh, total.
is
All right. Okay.
that I
yeah.
have got no clarity, and I can't
Yeah.
even speak to that. I
Correct.
don't even know. I don't have a breakdown of the 1.54 million figure, and I was hoping you could help me, but I think we are all quite
Just
in
as
the
blur.
dark.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cannot lah. We need to study this.
Yes.
Now, let's move on to density, shall we, and a different aspect of population. You get this really crowded feeling in Hong Kong and Shenzhen. Both cities do not feel that comfortable, actually. And in Hong Kong, you have 7.5 million over 11,000 square meters, or 6,880 people per square meter.
Square kilometer.
In Shenzhen, you have 12 million over 2,000 square meters, or 6,000 per square kilometers.
Yeah.
If ever we had 10 million, theoretically, is the target, as a target in Singapore, we will have 10 million over 766 square kilometers, or 13,000 people per square kilometer.
That might be the wrong calculation because
Obviously.
since the 1950s till today, we have grown at an average of 2 square kilometers per year. Singapore has grown by over 120 square kilometers already. And therefore, if we were to project forward that we continue to reclaim our seas, that and plus we are also reclaiming our underground, then we have a lot more space. So the number per square kilometer is abstract. What do you want to use that number to calculate? That's my question.
Yeah, but I want to add to that really it's not about the physical number, you know. It is about the quality of the people.
Yes.
You see, because
Or quality of life.
yeah,
And
I
for
mean,
the
if you
people.
take the other extreme, right, Silicon Valley in California, right, you have let's say 4 million people, right? They are actually changing the whole technological profile of the whole world.
Yes.
Okay. Now the question in Singapore is therefore, what is the political and cultural and economic environment that increases the labor productivity or intellectual productivity of the population, be it locals and foreigners?
Yes.
I don't think we need that many people.
Yes. So our planning needs to include what are the activities of these people in the 700 or 800 square kilometer landmass that we are given.
So that brings us to this qualitative point which you have brought up,
yeah.
Which is that if you look again at Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and you look at the possibility of escaping that density, do we have that same correlation? How important is the ability to escape this density? And do we have that here? Shenzhen and Hong Kong, I think you do. You take a train ride and you're in another city within an hour or so. We can go to JB, I suppose, or Batam.
Correct.
Is this important? Is this factor relevant?
We are not as crowded in the city center as Hong Kong feels to be.
Yes.
We are definitely better planned, better layout. Now the question then is, in the next 30 to 50 years, what sort of human activities do we want in this country? If it is going to be skewed heavily towards high quality, high intellectual property, then frankly speaking, the 6.9, we can be way below. The 10 million, we can be way below. But if we were way below, then is there a need to put in $100 billion into land transport infrastructure? Is there a need to build extra train stations which the ridership may not be able to justify?
You see, this is where I come in, right? Because I think the kind of urbanization pattern that we have is not a very, it's a very livable pattern, but it's not an efficient pattern because the densities are actually too low, you see. So ironically, if we were to increase the compaction, the compactness, right, which I call the 3D planning, right, where you stack, right, work below, live on top, right. In other words, the shop house model, right, live upstairs, work downstairs, right, but writ large, you know, right. We could actually accommodate, a lot more people, right, in a much more productive way of living.
And generate higher innovation.
Yeah, right. So you know, families living upstairs, children studying downstairs, right? And a university system that is dispersed over the entire island, right?
That is why Khush, about this definition of population density or urban density or somebody's new terminology called living density, we need to know why we are measuring density. And Professor Tay Kheng has, in the last 30 years, been trying to advocate for this planning model, which is a 3D urban plan model, where you're planning based on user activities. And it is the demographics and activities, the human activities, which we have failed to take into account when we set some of these population targets.
I've attended your talks and
I mean, just to make it very, very simple for people to understand,
Please.
we should turn the entire island into a campus. In other words, this is Island Singapore campus.
It's an interesting idea.
Everybody living here is a member of this university campus.
Yes.
Right?
I
It's
mean,
an educational city.
It's a lovely vision.
Yeah.
Let us now talk about the 2013 population white paper and actual population growth targets. And of course, now it becomes interesting because we will actually talk about the 10 million planning parameter, shall I call it. But if there was one, and we will discuss that, right? The population white paper published in January 2013 told us that Singapore would have a band of between 6.3 to 6.9
6.5 to 6.9.
6.5 to 6.9 million people by 2030. People were very unhappy and publicly protested. There was the Hong Lim protest specifically on this issue.
Yeah.
What did you think of this population growth target at the time? And can our small little island accommodate 6.9 million people by 2030? Let's just talk about that target.
I think the density, population density by itself is not a major variable, okay?
Yes.
The important variable is actually the intelligence and the technical capability, the knowledge capability of the population itself, right? Which could be a mix of locals as well as foreigners, right? And I don't think we should block off talented people from coming to Singapore. Yes. In fact, we should encourage talent, not only of foreigners, but locals as well. And this is really the opportunity cost that we are paying, right? In the kind of densification, the 10 million population is actually a penalty. It's a penalty for failure in improving the intelligence of our people.
That's quite an indictment.
It is. It is. It's a failure of planning.
When I read that paper
Thank you. Very interesting.
When I read that paper in 2013, I'm agnostic to what is the target. 6.5 at the low end to 6.9 million at the top end is fine with me because I understood this to be a planning target that we will evolve our old infrastructure and we will put in new infrastructure in order to move towards this target. And it is true that subsequent to the publication of this paper, Ministry of Health had a 2020 plan, and then there was our sports vision where we were planning for sports and health infrastructure, wellness type of activities, and we were planning stadiums integrated, for example, into the one in Tampines Hub now. Yes. And then we also had a land transport master plan where the minister then came up with cycling tracks, how many new buses we should be ordering. So we do need that for planning towards how we move to 2030. Subsequent to that, 2014, we had a revision of the master plan which took into account some of these numbers, and then it was announced Greater Southern Waterfront, Paya Lebar Air Base would be shifting out, and then that reassured me that yes, the jigsaw puzzle is coming into. You can't plan the growth of a country without having a certain target and planning parameter for the next 30 years.
So in other words, the target doesn't matter, the infrastructure matters.
And how we evolve and get there. And then, of course, just now we also mentioned that the social integration of growing the population.
There are social issues as well.
Yes.
But we'll certainly come back to the infrastructure point in just a bit. But I want to get to the 10 million population parameter and the controversy around it. Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan said during the debate, we will never have 10 million.
I wish he had said that much earlier.
I know. Yeah, me too. We won't even have 6.9 million.
Very true.
The government doesn't have a target for the population.
That I found to be odd because look, 2015 there was a downturn in the oil and gas offshore marine industry. We lost some workers there. We slowed down a little bit on construction. So last few years population growth hasn't kept up to the growth targets that were set out by the population white paper. So we are, in all likelihood, unless there's a real boom in jobs in the economy, in all likelihood, by the year 2030, we will not hit 6.5 million population. But if that could be made up for by increase in the number of intellectual workers, frankly, economic growth would still be assured. But we can't stop at having one target number in the year 2030, because in order to plan for 30 to 50 years, you need a further target date with a target set of infrastructure, economic GDP number, and population number.
I think what has been missing so far is the input of the technological factor, right? Because let's take the case of the role of automation.
Yes.
Right?
Job disruption.
No, automation requires very few high-level people who are capable of running the machines and so on and so forth. But it does not require a lot of workers.
Exactly.
Right? And therefore, for a small island city-state like Singapore with a relatively small population, right? To think of large population growth from 6.9 to 10 million is really contradictory.
Exactly.
Right? So in other words, the planning parameters, right, have assumed have been far too conservative in not considering the impact of technology, right? Like let's take the case of a simple case of cutting grass, right? You have 10 people cutting grass in a certain neighborhood, right? If you automate the cutting machines into robotic cutting machines, you need one person to run the whole thing. So one person versus 10 persons.
Yes.
So that is the kind of technological impact, right?
Yes.
So similarly, you see, for example, in my profession, architectural profession, we used to have hundreds and hundreds of draftsmen.
Yeah.
Today it's all done by computers, right? Yes. So the number of people required would decline.
Yes.
Right. So this is the issue.
But I would still like to know what is the new target, because if a new target were to be much lower, then I would be hesitant as a taxpayer to be paying for the 100 billion of land transport build out, and to be paying for example, the next reclamation of the next square kilometer of land in Singapore, because we keep saying that we are short of land. I've written a long piece of opinion piece to say that we actually can accommodate 10 million population in Singapore without reclaiming another square kilometer. So if the population targets were going to be much more depressed than what was touted in the past, let's question why taxpayers are still paying for land reclamation and to expand our land mass.
There's a question by Feroz Nadia that I want to draw your attention to. And she talks about many articles that she has read that mention our infrastructure, the infrastructure is going to be built up based on 10 million, the 10 million population. These articles mention HDB flats will be 40 stories high. So where did this 10 million planning target come from? So let's start with the Liu Tay Kheng pronouncement and then bring in the question that was posed. And the articles, you know. So let's just list out where this 10 million figure came from.
It came from Liu Tay Kheng.
Right.
Right, when he was a chief planner, right, and in the planning process,
Right.
of course, a lot of planning process is based on numericals, right? Yeah. So they have to assume certain population, certain economic growth, and so on and so forth. My suspicion is that the technological variable was omitted. They didn't understand, right? That the impact of productive technology on the extent of labor that's required, right? As I gave the example of grass cutting, right? If you have an automated grass cutter, you need a lot less people, yep. Right? But correspondingly, you have to pay the one person, right, a much higher wage, right? Now, this is the big issue, see, whether the 10 million population, does it assume a remuneration ratio that is too low? In other words, we are still based on the cheap labor model.
Probably.
Which we should not be. If we are a developed society, we should be working towards a high wage, high productivity economy, not a low wage, low productivity economy, which all the other surrounding countries in around Southeast Asia are already moving in that direction. If we are competing we cannot compete in that kind of environment. So we have to move into the high-tech environment.
That brings me to Mr. Noob's question over there.
Yes.
He says, who will do the low-quality work?
Machines.
Look, who will do the low-quality work? We have to understand that a lot of low-quality work becomes irrelevant anyway.
Yeah.
What happened to taxi driving? When I grew up, it used to be the safety net. If I happen to be out of a job when I'm 50 years old, I go and get myself a taxi license. Now, you bring in 200 fantastic engineers, they program an app, and then there's car ride sharing, and suddenly these 200 engineers' jobs displace the need for 2,000 taxi drivers' jobs. And some of these jobs would just become irrelevant.
Yeah,
we can't always go back to the question of, who wants to clean the plates?
Yeah.
And then when you move into robotic taxis, you don't even need the 200 engineers. So you need 2,000 engineers, did you say?
200
engineers,
engineers
you only need
displacing 2,000 taxi drivers, yeah.
So that's exactly what Joey Lim is trying to say. You know, can the target for the future be economic growth rather than population size?
Of course, yes.
He's actually talking about total factor productivity, really.
That's
and
right.
we are talking about wealth, we are talking about income, we are not talking about population.
Right.
Yes.
That's right, yeah.
So economic growth measured differently.
Thank you, Joey, and the answer is yes. We should be talking about that more than...
Yeah.
So, bringing you back to this $10 million, 10 million population confusion, several ministers referred to this parameter, did they not? Were there several pronouncements in public about it?
No,
Can you list them out?
No.
And who said what?
The main thing was in the meeting with the NTU students, at which the 10 million issue was raised, and I think it was Heng Swee Keat, right?
Yep.
Who said that, who actually did not ostensibly endorse the 10 million, but the fact that he referred to it uncritically implies that there is a kind of ascension involved. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that was where
So
it was cemented there.
Therefore, there's been a public outcry about this 10 million
Yeah.
planning parameter because of that.
Yeah,
That
right.
it seems to be a U-turn. But well, we welcome the U-turn anyway.
Yeah.
More than welcome it.
Okay, in that case, then something is contradictory here now, because in March this year, the Transport Ministry announced that up to 100 billion will be spent by the year 2030
Yes.
to develop our land transport infrastructure, out of which 80-something billion would be in the trains. Now, if the targets for population and which infer ridership, population and demographics and human activities would then equal to a certain ridership.
Yeah.
If the numbers are substantially reduced, hey, please, as a taxpayer, I'm not signing the check for the $100 billion land transport infrastructure.
Worse than that, I want to add this: that the issue of investing in more transportation, right, is really not the solution. The solution is how do you reduce the need for transportation, right?
That's another
so
urban
if you have,
planning
it's an urban planning
question,
issue,
yes.
right? So if you had, the 3D planning model, which I suggest, you live upstairs and work downstairs,
Yeah.
right? Then you actually need to travel much less.
Vertical.
Yeah.
You need more lifts.
Lives is fine because
Yes.
they are very efficient and non-polluting and non-stressful.
Yeah.
So I think that is where I think there's a disconnect in the physical planning, right, and in relation to the transport planning. I think the transport planning is really out of date.
So it depends how you look at the infrastructure that you
Yeah,
do.
right.
And that depends on the type of urban planning that you do.
Yeah, right.
Correct. So when they announced that budget, I was happy to see that budget because of the implied target trajectory of growth of the population. But now that it is clarified that we will not be near to that number, I want to re-question about some of these public expenses that we are
We
shouldering.
need a better discussion, and we need authorities like the URA to take into account not just technology but urban planning models.
Yeah.
And let's have some robust public debate and hopefully parliamentary debate
Yes.
on this subject,
Yeah.
so that we get the best ideas
Yeah.
for our urban planning.
Yeah, for example, we know that for the last couple of years, there's been a lot of road works, right? Digging up the roads, putting in cables and so on. We don't know what is it for.
And all
Is it to improve the infrastructure for the 10 million, and we are paying for it now? Why are we doing that?
Are different agencies?
But we don't know, see? We don't know. We just realize it when we drive on the roads, right?
There's
It's
no
congestion
straight road
everywhere.
anymore.
Yeah, right.
There's no straight road. I can't find a straight road anymore.
Absolutely.
Near Changi Airport. Khush.
And then all
Near
the
Changi Airport.
locums have gone haywire and we get flooding every day.
Yeah, no, that
So we
flooding is
gotta sort this
another
out,
issue. Flooding is
right?
another issue.
And luckily the sewerage is not acted up, or we might get, this might be a
Backflush.
shitstorm. Yeah. So we got to get this right. Yeah. We in the old days, heads would roll, but you're lucky that the PAP has lost its way, and now heads don't roll. But
If you were to introduce harakiri, it's not a head rolling, it's half the body
I don't
toppling
want to be
over. I think.
facetious about it, carrying on with the sewerage theme, but really, there are issues. I mean, we have ponding.
Yes.
Or flooding, ponding. We've had a very interesting discussion so far, and we're now coming to three more points. The population growth impact on jobs. The people are more and more, but the jobs are less and less. One of the main hot button issues during the GE 2011 was about foreigners denying Singaporean employment opportunities. Why are people not saying that now? Why is that not a hot issue now?
I would guess that in the last 5 to 6 years, technology has also removed a lot of our jobs. So maybe it is not purely blamed on foreigners anymore. Basic accounting work. Prof. Tay mentioned draftsmen because nowadays with CAD/CAM and with so much computer processing power, it is very easy for even young, fresh architects to draw up 3D models.
Disruptive technologies.
It is disruptive technologies.
That is one aspect as well. So no longer just foreigners, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But surely, more and more people, and less, and so this is a double whammy, in fact.
Yes.
If I may say so, I wouldn't say it is a factor to explain it away, but in fact, you have just described a double whammy.
It's
Disruptive
compounding.
technology is compounding the problem.
Yes.
No, we have been over the last 20 over years, been addicted to cheap
Low
labor, low cost labor, plentiful labor, that model, you know, because I think that we have not been able to implement the high productivity, mechanization, right, robotics and automation that we really ought to be going into, right? But I think the government was afraid that it would drive away the investors, right, who will go to cheap labor countries, and therefore we will lose the investment and so on and so forth. But I think that the moment for change is now, because the global economy is in stagnation, and therefore it is a good time to rethink all these issues, right, which we must.
I agree. So my question is a pointed one: are foreigners and the population growth and foreigners within that denying Singaporeans employment opportunities? What do you think?
It is a natural case of competition. When you introduce,
Supply and
so
demand.
it's statistically you just stand a lesser chance when there are more people competing for that job with you.
Correct.
And some employers, in fact, prefer getting a foreigner even if it is at the same cost, because back to our previous point, the foreigners don't complain as much because they want to remain here. If they brought up something that is thinking out of the box but it challenges conventional wisdom, they might lose their work passes and they go home.
Yeah.
I agree. Let us now talk about population and the impact on housing. Lee Kuan Yew was critically aware of housing as a political tool.
Yes.
Would you like to speak to us a little bit about that background and
Well, first of all, I think everywhere in the developed world, housing is a critical factor in political management. Okay, even if you look at, let's say, the Nazi period, right? When the Nazis came into power in 1933, right? What did they do? They built 60,000 houses. Why? Because they need to appeal to their supporters,
Yes.
that they are providing for their livelihood and their shelter and so on and so forth, right? So housing is a very critical political tool or political benefit. So when Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee came into power, right? They also did public housing on a big scale, right? And for example, in 1 year, right, the new PAP government built 15,000 flats in 1 year, which is the total of all the SIT flats built over the last 10 years, right? So this is the extent to which the PAP legitimized and gained the trust and support of the population. So therefore, housing is a political product. It's a political product.
To be fair, at that
government
time,
needs to supply housing.
Yes.
yes, but to be fair, at that time, we also had hygiene issues. I mean, the nation was coming up, we need to quickly industrialize, we want to provide good education, but if the living environment, the home environment were not good, then there would spawn diseases and all that. So public housing helped to sanitize and to improve and upgrade our living standards a lot.
No. In fact, Dr. Goh himself, his PhD thesis, right, which was done in the London School of Economics, right, which was a very left-wing institution at that time, right, was very concerned about urban incomes and housing, because he worked in the social welfare department during the British time, and he saw the terrible living conditions in Chinatown, right?
His PhD was in urban planning and poverty, was it not?
No. Urban incomes and housing.
Ah,
Urban incomes and housing. So he saw, right up front in front of his own eyes, the terrible conditions. I saw a map, for example, of Chinatown during in the 1940s, right? 1930s, right? And there are red dots to indicate where the tuberculosis incidents occurred. The entire map was covered with red dots. This is how terrible it was,
yes.
right?
To your point.
And I think Dr. Goh was very instrumental in pushing for the housing, right?
Yes.
But there was another dimension to it. In order to build the housing, you need land, right? In order to get the land, they had a Land Acquisition Act which had double function. On the one hand, it provided the land for the housing which was required. On the other hand, it decimated the protest group amongst the Chinese business people who were supporting the left-wing movement not because they were leftists, but because they were pro-China, and so on and so forth. So they supported that, right? So the acquisition of land for public housing, right, also was a political instrument to decimate the potential for political revolt. So that's how it works.
Population and
Yeah, right.
housing
right.
are political
Political
subjects.
Instruments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, the way they first started HDB and decided on how high HDB
Yeah.
should be, I think that there's a
Yeah,
story
yeah.
about Dr. Goh. Would you like to recount
In fact,
that?
I had a very interesting meeting with James Putucherry,
Yes.
who was at that time a political advisor to the Singapore government in 1959, 1960, 61 at that time, right? He was a leftist. But he told me that he had a meeting with Dr. Goh, right? And they did some arithmetic on a back of an envelope, and and Dr. Goh came to the conclusion, we need to build so many units of housing. The only place that's available immediately is Queenstown, right? And therefore he did his calculation, and he said we must have 10-story blocks, and that was it. And those 10-story blocks were actually built. So Dr. Goh can be said from that evidence to be the designer of the first 10-story blocks in Singapore.
That's true. In fact, there was a question about 40-story blocks. Maybe we can go back to that question. Is it there?
Yeah, there's a question about 40
40-story blocks? I don't see it anymore.
There was reply.
Oh, it was it? Okay. So we will, the other questions, there were a couple of questions that you just flashed. If we keep on building concrete buildings to house the 10 million, then our natural ecosystem will fail. The first thing we want to say is that we have now been told that the 10 million was a planning parameter by the then chief planner.
He
And
advocated
that's
it.
about it.
Yeah.
And that, okay, Minister Heng may have referred to it or discussed it,
Yeah.
but there is obviously now a retreat, or what I call social distancing from that figure, which is fine when we welcome it.
Political distancing.
Political distancing, great stuff. We like it, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll hold you to it.
But actually, I want to add something there. I want to make a comment there.
Yes, please, yeah.
The planning methodology, I have been very critical of the planning methodology itself.
Please,
Let me
yeah.
explain.
Yes, sir.
Because we did not use what I call the 3D planning model, we did not understand the total amount of floor space that every human being in Singapore needs for housing, for work, for shopping, for recreation, for every function of human beings, right?
Yes.
Now, if you take a 6 million population, right, and from my calculation, 25 square meters is what the average floor area required for housing of every category, right, from bungalows to flats to whatever, okay? The other 25 square meters is made up of shops, schools, office buildings, everything else, right? So it's 50 square meters per person, right? 50 square meters times 6 million people, let's say, right, is, what is that? 300 million square meters.
Yep.
The whole island is 750 million square meters. In other words, if you build a one-story building, it will only cover 1/3 of the island. In other words, number one, we are not short of land.
Definitely not.
Number two, the issue is not about land shortage. The issue is about urban form.
Yes.
So, if you have a two-story building, you will cover 1/6 of the island.
Yep.
If it is a 4-story building, you will cover 1/12 of the building of the land.
Yep.
If it is an 8-story building, you will cover 1/24 of the land. In other words, density is not a problem.
Yes.
It is lousy planning that is the problem. It's lousy planning methodology. Now, I know this because I did a town planning course, right?
Right.
The town planning course does not teach you 3-dimensional mathematics.
Yes.
Can we speak about living density for a moment? Because we talk about density not being a problem. This was the discussion with Chian.
The living density, frankly, or urban density, has got many different definitions depending on what the architect and the urban planner is using the definition to calculate.
Is that a problem? If not,
Why not we go to Center Point,
right.
and I'll ask you what is the urban planning density, and we visit Center Point at midnight, and we only see a few guys, and Center Point is a huge shopping mall. What is the density? So these densities, do you want to calculate based on the country, which is usually then called population density, or you want to calculate it based on the use type? And
usage, yeah. And time, yeah.
Usage and time, yes. And to add on to the critique about the planning parameters,
right.
we are still very stuck on live, work, play, which is a 50-year-old thinking in terms of urban planning. Today, Professor Tay has been going on about we need to plan for live, work, play, farm, heal, and learn, because life activities. So
which means you've got to stack all of this, you see? Right?
Yes. So you plan for the demographics and the activities of these humans within each category of the demographics. If you're 70 years old, you probably do more learn and farm,
right.
rather than work, right? So we need to incorporate all this thinking into our urban plan, and based on his rough calculations just now, you know that Singapore is really not short of land space.
And the consequence of that is two things. Number one, if you stack, right, you will be a much more efficient living environment, because you don't have to travel long distances. You don't have to spend a lot of time traveling, and, and congestion and so on. Secondly, it means that you need a lot less roads.
Yes.
Which means you can increase the amount of open space.
So why are we still paying for underground tunnel, underground cities?
No.
And why are we still reclaiming more land?
Underground for storage of materials and ammunition and
for dangerous materials. Fine.
Yeah, right.
So let's have better planning.
Yes.
Let's take a few questions, and there are about 3 questions there that are very interesting. The first one is from Mike Koo, but before that, I'd like to ask Terry to line up that video on the Austrian housing I sent you last night. Can you check that? Now, what's the benefit for Singaporeans when we increase... Oops, sorry, I need the question. No problem. Thank you. What's the benefit... Oh, sorry. There we are. What is the benefit for Singaporeans when we increase the population? Or more Singaporeans will lose their jobs to all these new immigrants? That's the concern of Mr. Mike Koo.
Okay, simple answer to the assumption was based on economic growth. An assumption of a certain percentage of growth of GDP implies that we need to create X number of jobs. The creation of jobs lead to a need for a larger labor force, and that larger labor force then, due to our low TFR, we've got to make up for that lack in the labor force by having immigration. Yeah, so that's as simple as that. However, it didn't take into account technological disruption. It didn't take into account a COVID-related sort of a job drain, and therefore some of these planning parameters are now off.
And worse, it did not take into account the possibility of local regional cooperation, right? For example, already a lot of our high labor content industries have moved to Batam, have also moved to Johor,
Yes.
right? Now, if we think of a larger area of Johor, Riau, and Sumatra, it's 45 million. What are we wasting our time thinking about 10 million?
Yes.
That
Right?
triangle.
So this is but this is a foreign relations issue. It is an issue of how do we gain trust, how do we gain cooperation amongst our neighbors and us, right? So this is a very important thing. We are too obsessed with this island, this little red dot. Let's forget the little red dot. Let's think larger, right? And work towards that. It's not to come overnight, but it requires a lot of diplomatic, lots of economic and educational initiatives which will be there. For example, because Jokowi's son studied in Singapore, right? His feelings towards Singapore is very different. Yep. Now, if Mahathir's sons had studied in Singapore, Mahathir himself studied in Singapore, but if all his sons studied in Singapore, the relationship between Singapore and Malaysia would be quite different. Yep. Now, this is the issue. Right? So I'm making this point that Singapore should develop, one major part of Singapore's strategic development should become an educational city, right? And bring in our neighboring friends and children to learn and study with our own children.
In other
So
words,
that the friendships form will be the basis for the future economy.
bringing this back to population, in other words, leveraging
Yeah.
these population centers nearby.
Correct.
Yes.
I've
So
understood
that we don't have to grow our own incessantly.
In
That's
fact, to be
right.
very fair, I think Mr. Goh Chok Tong, the Prime Minister at that time, he discussed this triangle.
He talked about
but
it.
then
yeah.
it
Yeah.
fizzled out.
No, it didn't fizzle out. We still have Sijori, right?
Yes, we have
right?
Sijori.
But the Sijori has kind of plateaued,
Right.
Right? It has developed.
It was a good
but
idea.
what's important is that it pioneered the institutional and informational systems, right? That made Sijori work, right? But the challenge now is how do we enlarge that, It is a very useful base already developed. Let's enlarge that into a much bigger region.
Sure. I think we can certainly talk about that. And it's
Yeah.
something that Parliament should debate with more,
For our next phase of growth, this would be important.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Veerasamy Rangasamy has a good question. Is the stop at 2 policy by Lee Kuan Yew, is that why we are facing the problem now?
I wouldn't
No,
say.
even if there was no such policy,
Right.
the natural effect of urbanization and high economic growth will actually reduce population.
Yes.
This is the evidence in every developed society. Japan,
Yes.
Korea, same thing.
Now, with a reduced fertility rate, but much higher educated workforce, why didn't we have got much higher value growth per person, per worker, the productivity of each person, as well as his ability not just to earn income, but to amass wealth? How come that didn't get factored in? So it's not the total number of humans, it is how much each human gets.
The quality of human intelligence and effort, right, has somehow been kind of suppressed because I think the political environment has been too oppressive.
Paternal.
Swee
Well,
Yong?
not just paternal. I think it's been dampening.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to ask you to address this totally unrelated question, but we will try to accommodate Mr. Charles Neo, second from the bottom, above Sharon. Charles Neo Pok Chow, what would you advise to fresh graduates, young couples on buying their first house that makes the most financial sense? Is there a one-line answer?
Yes, there is a one-line answer.
Okay, first Swee Yong.
Yeah.
Let's put him on the spot.
Yeah.
He's the property guru.
No, because we wrote this report together, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Given the state of the employment situation and especially post-COVID, we are in a gig economy. Don't commit yourself to a long-term 25-year handcuff of a home loan unless you really have built up and amassed sufficient savings. So I would say if you are going for a $300,000 BTO, have sufficient in your savings bank and your CPF ordinary account such that by the time you commit to the property, you're only signing up for a 10 to 15 year loan package and you have enough for a rainy day.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, but the other part of our FOSG report on housing is that we want a new model for the new BTOs.
Yes.
Which is that the price of the BTO flat is based only on the construction cost. And the land cost is not factored in at all.
Yes.
In other words, if you assume the construction cost to be $200 a square foot, right? Your let's say 80 square meter flat, right? Or 800 square feet flat would be
160,000.
160,000. That's affordable.
Yes.
Right?
On that note, and on the theme of housing, let's look at better public housing perhaps, and look at this short video.
Here in Vienna, 2/3 of it.
There's a technical difficulty. So basically here we're going to end our discussion. It's been fascinating, and I want to talk about the Austrian model. Yes. Maybe you can give us a little bit of political history on this. Talking about Karl Marx Hof and
Karl Marx Hof is a huge housing development in Vienna. Right. It is 1,100 meters long. It's the longest housing project in the world. Okay, it accommodates 5,000 people. Right. It was built in 1933 by the Socialist Party that came into power in Austria at that time. Yes. Now that is a very interesting thing, because at the same time, right, Hitler was building 60,000 low-cost housing in Germany. Right. So there was this contest between the left-wing communist government and the fascist Nazi government, right? So Europe was in the throes of a huge intellectual and ideological competition between the extreme left and the extreme right, okay? Now, what is very important is that Singapore took the position of a middle position, right? So social democracy, right, basically, which was advanced by Dr. Goh, right, and that whole group of early PAP leaders, right, who were in London at the time when the National Housing Program, right, under the Labour government in 1945 to 1951, right, were promoting, and we copied that model, okay. So I think that the housing became, I think, recognized as a very important political, ideological contest, right? To win the hearts and minds of the people.
But let's look at the Austrian model.
Yeah.
And maybe it's ready for telecast. We'll see.